1994, which means my first accident I ever worked on was major accident was the value jet accident down in the Everglades. Way back in the early mid-90s, I worked on the JFK accident, and in subsequent years, I worked on everything from the 9/11 terrorist attacks to the Space Shuttle Columbia, TWA 800, and then several others as the years progressed. So I'm going to be throwing a lot at you in this presentation. I'm going to leave time for the questions at the end, and hopefully we'll be able to answer a lot of your questions and kind of give a good overview of what the NTSB does. And can everyone see my screen at the moment? Should see a nice NTSB overview and NTSB logo.
I've got you, Dr. Bauer.
Okay, very good.
Looks good.
So as I mentioned, my name is Dan Bauer. I'm what's called an investigator in charge, and I'll kind of explain what that means as the presentation goes on, which means I lead the investigations, lead the team that performs the investigations of airplane accidents. Now I'm in the major investigations division, which means I do all the major air carrier accidents. Now, a little bit about the NTSB history. Some people don't know what the NTSB was, what the NTSB is, how long it's been around. So I'm going to give you a nice brief history of the NTSB. The NTSB was originally formed in 1967. That's where there was, prior to that, accidents were involved by, say, the particular regulator within a particular mode. For example, FAA, and there was perform a lot of the investigations. But a separate entity, NTSB, was formed in 1967 within the Department of Transportation that would investigate all modes of transportation. When we say all modes of transportation, we're talking modes that move a lot of people. So that's buses, trains, boats, etc. In April of 1975, we became our own independent agency, completely independent of the Department of Transportation. The reason that is many times we have to investigate Department of Transportation. They're the ones who make the rules. They're the ones who sometimes do a lot of the approvals, and we have to investigate, make sure those procedures are not contributory or possibly are contributory to the accident. So we became totally independent in 1974, which means there's no problems with, we maintain our independence. We have our own funding, our own budget, our own everything. So we're totally separate. And we report directly to Congress. So a little bit about the NTSB organization. As I mentioned, we are an independent agency. And there actually is a board, an actual board of the National Transportation Safety Board, consisting of 5 board members. However, most of the NTSB is a staff of specialists, which we're all career government employees, in the various fields of accident investigation. Down on the bottom here, we have our 5 board members, our 5 current board members, which are all presidential appointees and then approved by Congress. Similar as a FAA the FAA administrator or anybody else appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. Now, NTSB, we investigate all modes of transportation. I'm going to be specifically talking about aviation in this presentation, but we've got whole separate offices that investigate marine accidents, rail accidents, pipeline accidents, hazardous material, highway accidents, and I'll talk a little bit about space accidents. And when we say we investigate for the other modes, the marine, the rail, highway, For those, we're not going to do highways, not going to do individual car crashes, but we'll do the large motor carrier, school bus, large motor bus, or if there is a particular issue that spans across a large portion of the transportation industry. So we investigate in all modes of transportation. We report directly to Congress, independent agency. Now, we have no regulatory authority. We cannot set rules. We cannot make laws, nothing. But we do investigate the accidents. And I'll talk about a little bit about later. We did our only product, the only thing we produce, in addition to our reports of investigation, are recommendations. And we recommend changes to procedures, recommend changes to rules, recommend changes to how something is manufactured. That is our product. And we actually have and there's a lot of work, a lot of thought that goes into our recommendations. And we've got, I don't know what, it's probably about an 85 to 90% acceptance rate of our recommendations. So we've got 5 presidential appointed board members. They serve on a term after, I think it's a 2-year term, after you're reappointed, et cetera. There is we're supposed to be apolitical, but there is a slight political aspect to it in terms of the chairman is typically the same political party, and the majority of members are the same political party as whatever the acting president is, the current president. If there's a change in administration, then we will have a change in chairman come next January, or it might be the same. So, and again, these are political appointments. They come and go. Chairman's been here a while, several years, but all the other 410 employees, and of those, about 100 aviation investigators were all full-time career government employees. So our headquarters is in Washington, downtown Washington, D.C. That's where I work out of, where we deal with the major investigations for air carriers. Most of the other modes are from there. It's nice, central to the federal government. Our board members can go and meet with members of Congress as needed. We often our higher management goes and does briefings on the Hill, so that's all very convenient for that. But we do have 4 regional offices spread about across the country. Now, we only have about 390, or it might be up to about 400 employees total, but that's it across the entire country. At headquarters, we've got about 50 investigators for the Office of Aviation Safety, and we've got about 65 general aviation investigators spread across the country. And they are there for a nice quick response, and I'll get into what they do with general aviation in a little bit. And in addition to aviation, we've got, like I said, we've got investigators spread across the country and at headquarters in all of the other modes. Now, our mission. Our mission is to investigate and determine the facts, conditions, and circumstances of aviation accidents. Similar type mission statement for the other modes. This is, and our mission and our what we're required to do is determine the probable cause of the accident. And we don't assign blame. We don't try to break things down. We just determine probable cause and make recommendations to prevent similar accidents. We like to say that ours is strictly a safety investigation. Nothing that we examine, look into, can be used for violations, enforcement, etc. FAA does that separately, not as part of our safety investigation. So in addition to our probable cause that we publish, we always finish up an investigation with a report, probable cause. If needed, we make recommendations to prevent similar accidents and occurrences. And we may, in the course of investigation, have to issue that urgently if we find a safety deficiency that needs an immediate response or reaction. We may issue that recommendation while we're still performing an investigation. But typically, most of our recommendations are at the end of the entire accident investigation report generation procedure. We also do conduct special safety studies. If we see a particular issue that has a widespread across the aviation industry, we will conduct special safety study. And we've got one ongoing right now that I'm participating in, and it has to do with in-flight turbulence for commercial air carriers. A lot of our accidents and injuries right now are the result of in-flight turbulence. So we've got a special study going on right now to look at how and why these encounters are occurring and what different aviation groups and operators are doing to try and alleviate these turbulence encounters that may lead to injuries. And we may, we'll probably have that report out sometime next year. And so it's fairly interesting because it's such a widespread problem across all the different air carriers. Now, since we are a government agency, of course, we've got governing code of federal regulations that kind of lay out how we have to proceed in performing our duties. So if you want some nice boring legalese, you can look up the 49 Code of Federal Regulations. Can't even say it. Under Part 830 is the part that denotes the general notification and reporting of accidents and incidents. That's a requirement if a air carrier or if you as a private citizen has an accident, you're required to report it to the NTSB and I'm sure the FAA also. Also laid out in the Code of Federal Regulations is Part 831, which are the procedures that we are to use for our accident and incident investigations. And it kind of lays out, since we have, as investigators, we have I'm not going to say special powers, but we are entitled to a lot of information simply because we are engaged in an active accident investigation. So I mentioned the general notification and reporting for accidents and incidents. And of course, since we're the federal government, of course, we've got a definition of what an aircraft accident is. So it basically comes down to two parts. An aircraft accident will involve substantial damage to the aircraft. And of course, there's a definition of substantial damage. So that is something that adversely affects the structural strength, performance, or flight characteristics of the aircraft, and which would normally require major repair or replacement of the affected component. And we see here's a picture of something that happens quite often. It's considered an accident, but it's, doesn't make the news all the time except for a little blurb you may see. This is where a winglet has struck the rudder of another aircraft as it's sitting there waiting to take off, and we're on the taxiway and another airplane came by. And that certainly affects the flight characteristics of this RJ, it looks like, or is it a Q400? I'm not sure. And so that is considered an accident, and that is something that we will prepare a report. Odds are we're not going to launch out to this. We're not going to send a GO team. We're not going to send a bunch of investigators, but we will gather information and write up a report on this occurrence because it meets our definition of substantial damage, which means it's an aircraft accident, which means NTSB will investigate. Now, there's another portion of a definition of an aircraft accident. It's an occurrence that results in a serious injury. Of course, serious injury has got a definition in the CFRs. Serious injury is defined by hospitalization of greater than 48 hours, a fracture, except for fingers, toes, and nose. And when I mentioned that we're doing a special study on turbulence encounters, this comes up a lot because we've got, flight attendants that are, there's in-flight turbulence encounter, inadvertent, and they're up and about, they don't have their seatbelt on, and they get thrown whatever, so broken hip, broken arm, concussion, etc. So that is considered an accident because of the fractures that may occur. Severe hemorrhages, nerve, muscle, or tendon damage, internal organ damage, or any burn, something that involves a second or third degree burn, or any burn that's greater than 5% of somebody's skin. So anything that happens that goes above that criteria, NTSB will launch an investigation. Now, as I mentioned under the procedures, I'm not going to go too much into this. You can, if you're interested, you can read it yourself, but there are responsibilities of the board that are defined. Priority of the investigation. As I mentioned, NTSB does the safety investigation. Guarantee, while there always is, our colleagues at the Federal Aviation Administration will be performing their own investigations since they have the regulation and enforcement responsibility within the federal government. So they will be performing a parallel investigation, oftentimes using much of the same information we are using in the safety investigation. However, it is laid out within the CFRs that the NTSB investigation has top priority over any other investigation that might be occurring. It could be by the FAA, it could be by a state agency, it could be by the whoever. NTSB has top priority of the investigation and has access to any and all information first. Right to representation, that's the deal with if you're being interviewed, if somebody's being interviewed. The rights and responsibilities of the investigator in charge, which is what I am, and the authority of board representatives, which are other people that work at the board who are assisting me in the accident investigation, our authorities to access information, interview people, etc. And there's also definitions for parties to the investigation, which I'll talk a little bit about a little bit later, and access to release of information and also dissemination of accident information. We are a government agency. We do everything. We do everything in the public domain, and all information that we gather in the course of an accident investigation will be released to the public. Now, I'm going to talk about what I do and what occurs in the initial hours and few days of a major domestic aircraft accident investigation. This is always what you see in the movies, that shows up on the news, etc. It's the major domestic aircraft accident investigation. Now, but as I talk about this, all these procedures I'm going to talk about and things we go through, they're all going to be used to one extent or another in a smaller investigation, an investigation of someone's Cessna 182 that, breaks the landing gear and bends the wing on a runway. We're not going to send somebody out to that, but we're going to perform an investigation. And we may do a lot of these same procedures, but on a much smaller scale. So major domestic aircraft accident investigation, like we're shown here, fatalities, loss of, total destruction of an airplane, etc. That's kind of what I mean by major domestic aircraft investigation. Now, I could spend a whole half hour on this slide alone, but I won't. But kind of the investigative steps we take in a major domestic aviation accident is laid out here, but the same procedure is used on a scaled down investigation, general aviation accident investigation. It may minus a couple of these steps, but the general flow is like this, okay? We start out with on-scene activities. What we mean by on-scene activities, we get notification that an accident occurred and we need to get out and get as much information we can from the accident scene. There's a lot of information that can be perishable, tire tracks, indentations in the mud. We want to get that before it's washed away, before it's trampled on, etc. If you have a case like this, an airport typically wants to get an airplane moved so it can open up its runway again. So we get out there. Can be for general aviation accident, it could be in someone's backyard, it could be on a city street. So we need to get out there, get that information we can from the accident scene as quickly as possible. So there's a whole on-scene phase that occurs. After we get done with that on-scene phase, this phase here, the factual investigation follow-up activities, this is the lion's share of the time it takes for an accident investigation. I'll talk about that as we go on in this presentation a bit, but this is what takes up the most of the time, is getting all the factual information recorded and placed in a factual report so that we can place it on our public docket. If we need to, we may have a public hearing. Now, public hearing occurs in the middle of an accident investigation. We typically only do this for large cases where we need to do additional fact finding, where we want to get testimony from witnesses. We may want to open our public docket. So this public hearing doesn't occur a lot. I'd say this is fairly rare, only for the largest cases. So it won't occur in a lot of the smaller investigations. For a large case, we will have a final board meeting. And our final board meeting is where our 5 board members get together and discuss the findings, conclusions, and probable cause as presented by NTSB staff. The only people that talk and discuss the accident investigation during the final board meeting are the board members and NTSB staff. But this is kind of an important meeting because it's the first time that the board members amongst themselves are discussing the circumstances and the findings and conclusions of the accident. This is called our sunshine meeting because this entire process falls under the Government and the Sunshine Act, which means this is all happening in the public eye, in the sunshine, so that there's full transparency about the deliberations of the board members, who ultimately are the ones who sign off on the final report, probable cause, and the safety recommendations for the major accidents. So this is the first time that they're actually deliberating on it. Before the board meeting, the board members will meet individually with staff that worked on the accident, the staff that have prepared our reports, our final reports and recommendations. But in terms of them discussing it amongst themselves, that only happens at the final board meeting. And then the final thing that happens, final report is published, which includes probable cause. Okay, so for going back to a major air carrier accident or major accident of any type, the initial go team. It's called the go team because we're the ones who go to the accident site. We typically have to be, when we are on call, we are ready to respond and travel within 2 hours. And typically the go team is going to consist of the investigator in charge, like myself, who will manage and the entire investigation, and group chairman in different specialty areas. And I'll discuss what those are in a few. Other NTSB specialists who specialize in particular technical areas. We can, if there is a large interest, we may include a board member with the initial go team. And the board member is the person you're going to see on TV, conducting the press briefings, doing the interviews, etc. IIC, we've got enough stuff to do. We don't want to let the board member do all that stuff. Also include a public affairs person and transportation disaster assistance. That is a whole separate group, and they've got a great presentation that deal with the victims' families. Very important, very grueling group. They do one of our most important functions in terms of making sure the victims' family members are fully informed and aware of what we're doing. So on the go team, we have to be prepared to travel within 2 hours once we get the call. We fly sometimes using the FAA administrator's private airplane. Well, I shouldn't say it's a private airplane, it's a government-owned airplane. Or sometimes there's not gonna be enough people for everybody on the go team to get on the FAA airplane, so we have to fly commercial also. And as you would expect, we have to be prepared for all sorts of climatic conditions. We all have to be trained in biohazard mitigations, biohazard equipment, which can be present. Mechanical hazards are so numerous that nobody ever considers, would ever see anywhere else except for the large-scale accident site and just the overall general accident conditions. To be on the go team, we also have to have all the necessary travel documents. We have to bring our own tools. We could be out in the middle of nowhere. Any forms, currency, communications devices. You think there's cell phone coverage everywhere in the country. Well, it's not the case. Plenty of cases, times we've been places where there's no cell phone coverage. And when we have to communicate back to headquarters, that can be a problem. So here's an example, go team. This is actually a smaller go team, but we all get together. We get to DCA, Washington National. Hop on one of the FAA administrator's airplanes, and off we go to the accident site. So as I mentioned, board member, that's our on-scene spokesperson. They interact with the media, the family, and any federal, state, and local authorities. When a large accident occurs, the local government officials always want to know what's going on. Oh, yeah. What does it look like? What are we doing? What sort of response can we help with, et cetera? So that's what our board member is there for. Interact with them, handle all that incoming information. So investigator charge, like what I do. We organize the on-scene and the follow-on investigation. We lead the team of specialized investigators to collect the facts we can there on scene. The IICs were also the ones who provide information to the board member for their press briefings, so that they can speak intelligently to the press. And oftentimes, like here, board member may have the IIC with them to handle any questions that they can't which I think is great, instead of them just winging it. The IC works with the companies and kind of is the interface with the companies involved in the accident and other agencies. And because there's so many moving parts, sometimes large complexities, sometimes numerous layers to an accident, it can take 1 to 2 years to finish an investigation. Oftentimes they say it's, oh, that's so long, so long. Well, we want to look at everything. We don't want to, start focusing in on anything too soon. We look at everything. And then it can kind of once we look at everything, we can kind of winnow down into particular safety areas that may have contributed to the accident. Now, parties to the investigation. We're a small agency and we can't be experts in everything. We can't be an expert in Boeing 787 landing gear. We can't be experts in the procedures American Airlines uses to for landing, for doing Cat 3 landings. We don't know the particular forging methodology used when Pratt & Whitney built a particular type of engine. So we nominate parties to the investigation. That includes airlines, labor organizations, pilots unions, that is. The regulatory authority, the FAA. The FAA is the only group that is legally entitled to participate in every one of our investigations. They are doing a regulatory investigation, but they have a safety office that comes with us, the NTSB, side by side on every accident investigation. And the reason that is because sometimes we need the FAA to make a change immediately. And that's being there with us, they can do that. And as I mentioned, manufacturers, airplane manufacturers, engine manufacturers, electronics manufacturers, et cetera. Each party is going to have a party coordinator that works directly with the investigator in charge. And that party coordinator is high enough up in the company that they can quickly address a safety deficiency. If we're doing an investigation and we see American Airlines, they've got a problem in one of their procedures and it needs to be changed now. That party coordinator has to be high enough in the company that they can make it happen without getting approvals from this vice president, this division head, et cetera. In addition to the party coordinator, the parties to the investigation also have group members on some of the technical groups participating in the investigation. And these group members from the parties contribute a specific technical expertise to that investigative group. And they only participate in groups that can use their expertise. We're not going to have an engine person on a group that's looking at flight attendants and how they perform their duties. We're not going to have somebody from the pilots union, on something that doesn't involve flight operations. Law enforcement. When we first respond to an accident, FBI is always going to be there with us. They respond by law. We got an extensive amount of information sharing between the NTSB and FBI. The reason for that is if there is a suspicion of foul play, the FBI is notified at once. And any indication of a criminal act or foul play, the FBI assumes the lead. And then the NTSB provides support to that investigation of the criminal act. 9/11, perfect example. We knew before we even started that investigation, there was a criminal act. FBI was the lead. We assisted on that accident on scene. I spent a lot of time at the Pentagon. The FBI doesn't know what an airplane part looks like from, something from one of the offices that was impacted. So They don't know how to interpret the data that comes out of the flight data recorder, et cetera. So we provide support. We have a formal agreement between the NTSBI and FBI leaders currently that makes that nice and smooth and seamless. And along this lines, there was one time I was on call and had to utilize this. Got a call from Alaska Airlines, and kind of an odd call because normally I get a call and they say, "Oh, we had this accident involving this airplane, or this airplane's missing and we haven't heard from it in a while, so we're just letting you know." I got a call from Alaska Airlines and they said, "Yeah, we think one of our airplanes is going to crash." And I'm like, "Okay, so how do you know that?" And they say, "Well, somebody went out to the airfield and stole it and he's out in a joyride right now." It's like, "Yeah, okay. I'm going to get you in touch with the FBI because that's obviously a criminal act." And if you recall, that gentleman up there in Seattle area took an Alaska Airlines Q400 for a joyride, ended up crashing it. And in that case, we did assist the FBI with collecting information on scene, gathering all the data we could, help them understand it as they finish their investigation. Now, I kept mentioning NTSB Group Chairman. The NTSB Group Chairman guides specialty areas of the investigation, and they will oversee the party group members. So you could have an NTSB Group Chairman, and he will have a group that is working for him, and it could have somebody from the airlines, somebody from Boeing, somebody from the pilots union, somebody from the maintenance workers union, all working for that particular group chairman. The NTSB Group Chairman, that's the guy who directly contacts me, the IIC, to inform them of their activities, what their plans are for that group, if there's any problems, if there's any needs, specialty equipment they may need. They let the IIC know, and IIC will make it happen. Each group completes a set of field notes from the on-scene portion and factual reports of all the factual information that is gathered by that particular group in the course of the investigation. So you'll find, if you look on our website on the public docket for a particular accident, if it's a large accident where we had an entire GO team launched to the accident, you're going to find group chairman reports, factual reports from all different specialty areas. So let's give an example of what some of the different specialty areas that will launch out to a larger air carrier accident, or, for a smaller accident, we may utilize one or two of these different specialties. Aircraft structures. Just as the name applies, that's the group that's going to go out and look at the structural damage that occurred in a particular accident. Wings, pylons, engine pylon mountings, fuselage, all the flight controls, etc. Document all of that damage that occurred in the accident. And obviously, a good portion of that accident is like, hey, is that something that occurred after and post-impact, pre-impact? They will document and create the structures group wreckage diagrams, wreckage debris fields diagrams, for the investigation. Document any sort of, there's problems with runways and pieces that are around. It's oftentimes important to be able to differentiate other equipment from airplane equipment. A structures person has the expertise to do that. And sometimes if an airplane is not fully torn apart, they have to go in and examine, document deformations, bendings, etc., of the structure itself. Systems. I feel bad for the systems guys sometimes. They got to go digging through and look at all electronic systems, hydraulic systems, flight control systems, cables, etc. So they're digging through, they're starting here in the cockpit area and trying to dig through and establish continuity, if possible, operation of all the different subsystems on the airplane. Oftentimes they're going to sit there and pull out a bunch of electronic boxes from the wreckage to later on download non-volatile memory, see if we can get any other additional information for the accident. Power plants, pretty self-explanatory. They're the guys that look at the engines. Anything that flies apart, they're the ones looking at it. It's always interesting to see typically the power plant ends where the pylon starts, and that goes on to the structures guys, document that. But just as the name implies. Survival factors. This is an interesting group. When there is a survivable space, like on this accident, they will go in and document all the deformations of the floor beams, cabin area, seats, seat supports, examine seat belts. They'll do diagrams of injuries, deaths, etc. They'll examine if there are emergency evacuations, procedures used, flight attendants, how they performed, the evacuation, etc. Airports group will look at if an accident occurs on an airport fire and rescue response, emergency plans that might be in place. Air traffic control, pretty self-explanatory, examines the actions and data available to the air traffic controllers, how they handled the situation. Aircraft performance. Aircraft performance, I actually did aircraft performance for about 10 years before I moved over to be an investigator in charge. And aircraft performance will take data from several sources: flight data recorder, radar data, tire track information, and examine the motion of the airplane before and during the accident sequence, and try to look at what sort of forces caused that motion. Often though, the aircraft performance will help put together an animation of an accident based on flight data recorder, cockpit voice recorder information, radar information for overlays on the ground, just to help try and give a good overview of the accident sequence. Operations human performance will look at specifically the pilot themselves, how they executed the procedures. They look at the company procedures themselves, look at the regulations, they'll look at flight crew training. When we include human performance, they will also look at flight crew experience. They'll look at 24, 48, and 1 week history of activities, look at fatigue, look at things like influences of any medications, etc. So these operations human performance reports can get rather large. Those are kind of the main groups we almost always stand up. There may be additional groups as needed based on accident circumstances. Weather, we have our own staff of meteorologists. We may have to interview witnesses. Larger major air carrier accidents, we're always going to go and take a look at the maintenance records. That's something that's going to occur while the GO team is out on scene. The maintenance records are going to be going to an operator's home base to examine maintenance records. At our laboratory back in Washington, here in headquarters, we have a recorder's lab and a metallurgical lab. Now, a recorder's lab, primarily, you always hear about, does the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. Those are taken back to our lab as quickly as possible. We usually have an initial audition, but we will have large groups with party representatives to look at and listen to the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder to make sure we have all the data transcribed accurately. And that is eventually released on our website. Our metallurgical lab, we have a metallurgical lab with many large-scale metallurgical capability. It supports not only aviation, but all the other modes, highway, rail, marine. Our metallurgical lab is very busy. So when I speak of the labs, FDR, CVR, and a metallurgical lab, they're located in we have a separate office called the Office of Research and Engineering. And they're kind of their own separate office since they support many of the other modes too. There's recorders on ships, there's recorders on trains, recorders on buses, they look at videos, etc. So now, international Go team. I could do a whole nother hour presentation on this. The international Go team, when there is a major accident in another country that involves a US built aircraft or a US operator or a US registered aircraft, the NTSB participates in that investigation under the provisions of ICAO Annex 13. Sometimes, if it involves fatalities of US citizens, we have a right under ICAO Annex 13 to participate in the accident investigation of the other country. And instead of referring to the operators, the US Airlines, the United, et cetera, or the design and manufacturer, the Boeing, the Pratt & Whitney, et cetera, instead of parties, these companies are considered tech advisors to the NTSB accredited representative, who then the accredited representative, who's like myself, then works with the investigation the other country is performing. And here's an example. Here's an Air Niugini 737-800 that dumped in the water short of the runway down in Micronesia that I launched out onto and participated in their investigation, along with representatives from Boeing on that accident. So for these international investigations, where the point of impact is determines the nature of the investigation and who performs the investigation. So we always get the question, what if it's out in the open, in the ocean? Well, if it's in US waters, then the US is investigating. But if an airplane crashes on anywhere in another country, that country performs the accident investigation. So we always get the question, foreign waters or international waters for that matter. There is an ICAO Annex 13, guides the investigation, and for, say, for example, international waters, there's a provision that the state of registry of the airplane can perform the investigation. Air France 447 is a great example. That was out in the middle of the Atlantic, but since that was an airplane that was registered to France, to Air France, then the French BEA, which is basically their NTSB, performed the investigation. As I mentioned, technical advisors are appointed for the purpose of assisting the accredited representative and provide technical expertise to the investigation and participate under the supervision of the accredited representative. And because there's so many airplanes flying all over and we don't know where we're going to go, you never know where you're going to go. And here's a picture of myself and my accredited representatives. We were in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And here we are wearing we were given traditional Kyrgyz hats, which I still have in my office, which was a very nice gift from the Kyrgyzstan Ministry of Transport. Now, these foreign accidents, there can often be considerable differences between how they perform their accident investigation and we perform the NTSB performs accident investigations. We do everything and release everything. However, in many of these foreign countries, there is a judicial involvement. France is a perfect example. If there's a fatality, then their Department of Justice is opening a parallel investigation and can seize much of the information that is needed for the safety investigation. So that's always there. They can have different political pressures than we have here in the States. Site security might be lacking. Yeah, that's rather considerable compared to what we have here. The different investigative groups might not have a leader, and sometimes the U.S. interests have to step in and kind of guide those groups on how they should perform their investigations. Sharing, many times the foreign countries do not want to share information with the investigative team. And it takes a bit of diplomacy on the part of the NTSB to get some of that information shared. Many of these foreign countries performing accident investigation, there is no public release of the investigation info like we do here in the States. Just a final report issued. I mentioned commercial space accidents, of which there's been a few in the past few years. Commercial space accident. That's something that we as the NTSB have started doing recently, since there is now several commercial launch operators. NASA's not the only game in town for launching things into space. However, many of these commercial launch operators, if they are launching in the United States, they have to obtain an FAA license. And if an accident occurs while an operator is under an FAA license, the NTSB will investigate that accident. And that typically is going to involve, when something either involves a fatality, like has happened already once with Virgin Galactic during a test flight, or there can be, if there's if there's debris falls outside the safety zone, different things like that, the NTSB will investigate. Some of the big four commercial launch operators currently operating, SpaceX, they're sending people up to the space station now, plans to send people to moon. So they're hauling passengers. United Launch Alliance has been around forever, launch satellites all the time. Blue Origin plan to start taking passengers on space tourism up next year, I believe, and also have a heavy lift capability that they're developing, and will fly out of down at the Cape in Florida. Virgin Galactic, another company that will start space tourism probably next year. So these are all operators that we may have to investigate. SpaceX, we've actually have a good relationship with them. We participated in and advised them on some of their mishaps where there's been an accident. I can't call it an accident because it's not an accident. There's always going to be a destruction of the vehicle, but it might be a premature destruction. So there was a booster, one of the Falcon boosters that blew up a minute after launch down there in the Cape. It stayed within the safety area, but we participated and observed their mishap investigation along with the FAA. So we got to know meet all the right people, know their procedures, know their vehicles, etc. So now I mentioned a lot of times we may only launch a partial go team. We're not going to send the full cadre of all the specialists. So it might be the investigator in charge and just one or two other specialists, and then we'll have people from the parties. Typically, one of these partial go teams, we actually do more of these than you think, will be something where it's not non-fatal, might be a hull loss of the aircraft. However, there can be pertinent safety issues and good public interest that warrant an investigation. And we love, if there's got to be an accident, we love these partial go team accidents because many of them, nobody gets hurt, nobody dies, and we can learn some stuff. That is the best. It's, you know, it's that these are type, if there's going to be accidents, these are the type we want, where nobody is killed, nobody gets seriously injured. Examples. Did this Delta airplane skidded off the side of the runway in LaGuardia Airport, almost went in the bay, but did not, hung up on the berm. We learned a lot of good stuff in that accident investigation. Did a FedEx MD-10 down in Fort Lauderdale. Landing gear failed during landing, dragged the wing down the side of the runway, which leaked fuel, which then caught on fire. There was a beautiful 500-foot long stream of fire next to the runway. Wing caught on fire, exploded, etc. But the crew got out. Their emergency slid down the ropes. One of the crew members did burn his hands a bit, just from friction burn, but nobody got seriously hurt. Launched a partial go team on that, myself and 2 or 3 other investigators, and then a whole lot of help from the airport and other party members. This is an accident I'm currently working on, trying to finish up. Jacksonville Naval Air Station, Miami Air, bringing servicemen and their families from Guantanamo Bay back to Jacksonville Naval Air Station. Navy guys and gals and their families went off the end of the runway, Jacksonville Naval Air Station. Luckily, water not too deep. Everybody got out. Nobody was hurt. It was very orderly, very good. And we're currently writing the report on that accident. Now, I want to mention some of the new techniques we're using and other ways we get information when we are in the course of an accident investigation. We have started using drones for mapping the wreckage field. These drones, we actually have our own. For the longest time, we were prohibited from, NTSB was prohibited from owning and operating our own aircraft, so we had to lease. We got a waiver on that, so now we have a few people who are certified drone pilots for use in our accident investigations. Other things we're doing to give information to the public, I'll have an example of B-roll documentation. We released a lot of that late nowadays because we know there's people on scene, there's first responders, everybody's got a cell phone. There's cameras with incredible zoom lenses, et cetera. So if we want to get information out, we want to make sure it's accurate and shows stuff properly. And so there's no, armchair investigators trying to interpret what's seen on a telephoto lens. We also collect information from social media. So first, for the drone photography, we use it not only for photography, and as you would expect, it gives us a great perspective you can't get on the ground. We see ground scar information compared to airports, etc. Drones, we use drones on, for example, this is in a derailment where there's a release of toxic chemicals, but we can get in and look and see what may have contributed to the accident early. We can even take the drone information collected by the drone, create an orthomosaic, which includes elevation and imagery, to try and get to kind of correlate our witness marks along with terrain. And as I mentioned, we can get access to hazardous areas early, before, say, for example, people can even go in. And in this case, in this gas pipeline, we had an area that the crater was continually collapsing as the gas pipeline continued to burn, but we're able to see and examine and detail that. And so we've even used it, recent Atlas Air accident, where we were laying out all the information. Atlas Air, if you recall, down outside of Houston, cargo airplane, highly fractured after it hit the shallow water in the bay. So as we laid the wreckage out, we could get a good overview using the drone. B-roll documentation. I'm going to go ahead and roll this. If we can get it to work. Come on. Yeah, let me try it here. All right, I'm not going to try and do that. Let's see if that's going to work. Yep. On our website, you'll be able to see, and this is really just kind of the B-roll documentation that we provide to news organizations. And it kind of shows NTSB investigators walking around the accident site, looking at things, and they can use it as a backdrop as they're describing, the accident itself. And that way we know it's actual good information from the accident site that we've provided, and shows things accurately. Social media. We definitely examine social media, because what always happens as soon as there's an airplane off the side of the runway or something, somebody turns around, snaps a picture and tweets, "My airplane just crashed," or whatever. So we do scour social media. We get some good information that we might not get otherwise, because we can't get there while people are exiting. And one thing we always see is people grabbing their bags, even this little girl, as they're trying to do their emergency evacuation. And sometimes things show up on the front of the New York Post. That's my Delta Airlines that skidded off the side of the runway in snow. So now I'm going to talk quickly as time is rolling on about the post-on-scene investigation and report preparation. This is the part of our investigation that takes the longest. Sometimes it's the most interesting, because we really start to get down into the data we've collected. So after we leave on scene, come back to headquarters, there's additional investigative work that's going to occur at our lab, at the airline, at the manufacturer. We could use other testing facilities. Oftentimes we'll do simulator work. We'll do further examinations of small components. We'll dig into all those electronics, but that all takes time. And we also we try to do as much as possible in the group setting. And that will carry all the same rules as on scene. We'll do additional interviews of people that may have known flight crews, of the flight crew himself, people that have trained flight crews, etc. They're conducted by the group chairman and or the IIC. All group members attend. If someone is interviewed, they are entitled to a representative of their choice. It can be a lawyer, it can be a union rep, it can be your brother, whoever. But anyone who's interviewed by the NTSB is entitled to have a representative with them at the interview. And if it is sworn testimony, it will be recorded in part of our public record. Other additional work, we can do sound spectrum work on the cockpit voice recorder. Sometimes we can pick up little details of engine speeds, etc. We see evidences of loud noises. This looks like a turbine disc failure accident. So we're going to correlate that with other data we have. So once a group, an investigative group, completes their report, they develop a group factual report. The factual report contains factual information only. There's no analysis, there's no inferences, there's no conclusions. It's just factual information developed by the entire investigative group that includes the party members, the people from the airline, the people from the Boeings, people from the manufacturers, from the Cessna. And this is authored by everyone. The group chairman's on there, but everybody who participated in the group is also listed. These factual reports end up being placed in our docket that is on our website and can be accessed by anyone. And boy, this is an old DMS page. Actually, I have a new interface. Some dockets are not going to be that populated. If it's a smaller accident investigation, smaller docket. Bigger accident investigation, big docket. As I mentioned, we will occasionally have a public hearing only for a major catastrophic high public interest accident. We may need to gather testimony on additional issues. We present the data we have to date, up to that date. But the whole purpose is to demonstrate a complete and open and objective investigation. We get to a point in the accident investigation where we have what's called a technical review, which means we've come to the point where we've collected all of the factual information that we're going to collect. And one slide I don't have on here is just a quick note about the way we do our investigations and the way we write our reports. It's broken down separately into a factual portion of the investigation and a factual report. That is what is on our public website. Factual reports for all the different specialty areas. Once we have a technical review and all the parties agree, yep, we've gotten all the information we need, NTSB staff will take that factual information and create an analysis where they analyze the factual data and then come up with some conclusions based on the analysis, which is based on the factual information. Now, the parties to the investigation, they have an opportunity to create their own analysis of the factual data to submit to the NTSB. It's called a submission. Sometimes the submission by a party to an investigation may have different conclusions, different probable cause, proposed probable cause, etc., than the NTSB staff analysis conclusions. But all of those are sent to the board members for consideration in a final board meeting. In the final board meeting, the board members review the NTSB draft final report with the staff. The board members would have had a chance to examine the submissions from the parties, and a lot of these major issues will be discussed at length. At this final board meeting, the final report, conclusions, and probable cause and recommendations are all adopted and then placed into a final report. that is placed on our website. Smaller accident, we may not have a board meeting. And the approval of the final report is done by the director of the Office of Aviation Safety. And a much smaller accident report will be placed on our website. And there may not even be recommendations with a smaller report. Typically, if we're going to have recommendations, it's going to be a large scale report. Now, recommendations. That's the main purpose for our accident investigation. Usually comes out in the form of a letter sent directly to, for example, the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administrator. I'm sorry, the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. Could go to president of Boeing Corporation, etc. And here's a typical type of wording in one of our recommendations. Require that all 14 CFR Part 121 operators establish procedures requiring all crew members to flight deck to positively confirm and cross-check the airplane's location at the assigned departure runway before crossing the hold short line for takeoff. So it can be very specific and, you know, kind of drilled down into a subject area as that. So see, I'm at 7:48, so I'm going to stop my presentation here. And I think at this point, I would be happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Bauer. And I think early on in the presentation, someone asked if the NTSB did indeed investigate the Tesla accident in which the driver was found to be distracted. I think they were wondering if that was an NTSB-led investigation.
We did do we've done a couple of Tesla investigations. I know we have. Because I know that also led to Tesla, and boy, it was a great presentation on it, on what you should not do as a party. Tesla did that and released investigative information, and we kicked them off the investigation. And also Elon Musk hung up on our chairman, so that kind of made an interesting story. So yes, so we did do an investigation of few of the Tesla accidents, yes.
Someone asked, how is security maintained at an accident site, and how is the accident site maintained in a sterile way when many agencies are present, NTSB, FAA, FBI, fire and rescue, witnesses, or other law enforcement media, and who coordinates?
For the initial response, we utilize and we tell all first responders to do whatever they can, of course, for any victims. That's top priority. Don't care about preserving anything if you've got to recover victims. Once NTSB arrives, the investigator in charge kind of oversees all of the different agencies, everything. So we set up site security utilizing typically local law enforcement is typically who is going to establish site security for us. I mentioned the FBI. Lately, we've had FBI, we've got an MOU with the FBI evidence response team that will come out and help us document the site. So if they've also got large personnel to help out with site security and site access for us. So it's kind of whatever we can to establish site security. We'll do it if it's local law enforcement, local first responders, FBI, and sometimes we've even had to hire private security to help provide site security. In the States, it's pretty good. It's very good. Local law enforcement's always great to work with, and they usually provide a good amount. They can usually provide site security as needed.
Thank you. Does anybody else have questions for Dr. Bauer? We didn't really talk quite yet.
Dr. Bauer, earlier in the day, we had heard from another guest speaker from the Coast Guard who talked about human factors. And so my question to you is, how is you and your team, you're arriving on a scene that often has death and destruction, and how do you handle that and your human factors of dealing with that, and what is your support after the fact? Because there's all, you've got a job to do and you're obviously professional, but it's obviously at the end of the day going to be very difficult for you and your team.
Yeah, there's always I want to say the more seasoned investigators that have done this for a while and have better coping mechanisms for dealing with it, and it may not affect as much. There's always going to be younger, less experienced people that come out and could be considerably more affected. So we do have available for us anytime during the accident investigation types of support, people we can reach out to, counselors, etc. There's, I do have to admit, having a focus and a job to do does help it a lot. And that you're, the whole purpose of your job there is to prevent this from happening again, which really kind of gives you a good focus, something to focus on, and maybe not at the time think about all the all the bad stuff you see, and it's always going to come back later. You're going to be like, oh dang, that was pretty bad. So if there's any counseling or anything, that's available to us if we need it for any of our investigators. And also, that extends out to, because us from the NTSB, we're doing this all the time, and we might work with people from Boeing or from the airline that have never done it. So oftentimes the services that are available to us, we can say to them, hey, you're entitled to use this too. You're working for us. You're working for the NTSB. So you're entitled to use this if you need it,
And Brian Monaghan asked, how has COVID-19 affected NTSB operations?
Quite considerably. We have largely been shut down from launching out to accidents on a large scale. Right now, each accident response is being evaluated on a individual basis in terms of sending investigators. When it is decided that yes, we're going to send investigators, we have instituted a COVID-19 mitigation plan that has to be followed. Everything from analyzing where investigators are traveling from and to in terms of incident rate. There has to be a good accounting of mitigations that are available, that the investigators will use, and with everybody we work with. So it's kind of interesting because many times the accident site itself is not going to be what the concern is. The concern is going to be traveling there, or when the investigators are done with their day and need to go get a bite to eat and need to, stay at a hotel. That may be where the higher risk is, because an accident site, you can control who has access to it. So those are all things that are going into the COVID-19. We hope it's going to be, like everybody else, we want to get back to doing things normally. But for right now, we have all sorts of mitigations in place to do our job as best we can and collect information. Maybe later we might take wreckage and move it to a storage yard and say, okay, we're going to go do a full examination in 2 months or whatever, when perhaps the risk is less.
Great. And TJ Gillis asked, what is the most common, or what are the most common errors you see by commercial crews?
Oh boy, I hate to lump all errors into one category. A lot of, but there's always sometimes common themes, and I'd have to say sometimes it might be a bit of maybe complacency and not fully adhering to procedures. If I have to try to be, I'm not trying to be too general, but that's we kind of see that, we hate to be in these investigations and just say, hey, follow the procedures and this would have been fine. But sometimes that's what it is.
Thank you. And Bob asked, will the Kobe accident result in a public hearing?
That is still being decided. I don't think we're going to have a public hearing, but the whole question is we may have a final board meeting. That is still yet to be decided. That's still an open, active investigation. So that is yet to be determined.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Bauer? If so, please feel free to unmute yourselves as well.
Yeah, I have a question. So, Dr. Bauer, I just connected with you on LinkedIn, and I saw that you were in NTSB for more than 25 years. And so my question is, did you have any role in what happened in 9/11, or what did the NTSB kind of do in general for 9/11?
Yeah, we responded almost immediately for 9/11, even though it was very clear it was a terrorist attack. Flight 93 up in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, that was obviously the most like a normal accident scene. But we were working for the FBI in that case. FBI took the lead. NTSB was doing what we normally do for an accident investigation. But in that case, we're collecting data for the FBI to use in their criminal investigation. I personally was over at the Pentagon, and what the FBI doesn't know is, if there's a pile of rubble, what is an airplane part and what is a piece of a desk or part of a computer from the Pentagon that was hit. And similarly with up in New York. We also, for the FBI, and one thing I did personally was analyze a lot of the flight data recorder data and the radar data to just kind of specify the flight path of the airplane, what was occurring in the cockpit, et cetera. So we did all that for the FBI.
Good question, Kobe. I agree with Lisa on that. That was a good question. Is there any other questions for Dr. Bauer? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bauer, for being with us tonight, taking the time out of your day, especially in the evening, to present to this group. We very much appreciate it. And that was very insightful. There's a lot of questions, I guess, as the student or even the professional, on what the NTSB does during the investigative process. And now I know I can walk away knowing a lot more. Just to reiterate a couple things, we are recording this presentation. It will be uploaded to YouTube at a later time for those of you that weren't in right in the beginning. And again, if you're looking for NBAA credit or FAA Wings credit, send us an email at snusafety.snu.edu, snusafety@snu.edu. Long day. And we'll be sure to work on that with you. Again, Dr. Bauer, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bauer. Have a nice weekend.
Thanks, you too.
Everybody else as well. Thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Bauer.
You're welcome.
All right, I'm going to close the event out. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye now.
Bye. Bye, Lisa. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thanks. The